February 14th, 1942. 20 miles off the coast of Cape Lookout, North Carolina. The gray Atlantic waters heave. Inside the cramped metallic confines of U-123, Kapitänleutnant Hardigan scans the horizon through his periscope. The air is thick with the smell of diesel oil and unwashed bodies. For weeks, his U-boat has operated with impunity, part of the devastating assault on America's coastline codenamed Operation Drumbeat. They are the wolves, and this is their hunting ground. Suddenly, the watch officer points. "Flugzeug, Herr Kapitän, starboard beam!" Hardigan swings the scope. There, buzzing absurdly low over the waves, is an American aircraft. But it's not a fast-moving bomber or a sleek fighter. It's a Vought OS2U Kingfisher, a small single-engine float plane launched from a nearby tender. It putters along at a laughable 160 miles per hour, its single pontoon seeming to drag it down. On the bridge of the surfaced U-boat, the lookouts laugh. They call these planes fliegende Zielscheiben, flying targets. The Kingfisher pilot, an ensign fresh from flight school in Pensacola, Alabama, sees the submarine. He banks, his observer tapping out a frantic contact report on his radio. But what can he do? His aircraft carries at most 225-pound depth charges. The U-boat crew doesn't even bother to man their flak guns. Hardigan gives a single order. "Alarm! Tauchen!" With a hiss of venting air, U-123 slips beneath the waves, the laughter of its crew muffled by the sea. The Kingfisher circles the patch of swirling water, a helpless spectator. The ensign can only watch as the wolf escapes, knowing that by nightfall another tanker will burn. This was the reality of the air war over the Atlantic in early 1942. The Allies were losing. The second happy time was in full swing, and U-boat aces like Hardigan, Kretschmer, and Preen had turned the sea lanes into a graveyard. The Allies had a critical gap in air cover, the infamous Black Pit in the mid-Atlantic, where land-based bombers couldn't reach. But even closer to home, their defenses were thin. They relied on stopgap measures, and the Vought OS2U Kingfisher was the definition of a stopgap. It was never designed for frontline anti-submarine warfare. It was a scout plane, built to be launched by catapult from battleships and cruisers to spot enemy fleets and guide the fall of naval gunfire. It was slow, underpowered, and woefully underarmed. Its pilots were often the least experienced, assigned to what was considered a mundane, second-line duty. To the hardened U-Bootwaffe, the Kingfisher was a joke. It was a flimsy annoyance, a symbol of America's desperate unpreparedness. The U-boat commanders feared the coordinated hunter-killer groups, the long-range Liberator bombers, and the relentless tenacity of Royal Navy destroyers. They did not fear this floating bathtub with wings. Their arrogance was built on a foundation of success. Their acoustic torpedoes were deadly. Their Wolfpack tactics, coordinated by Karl Donitz himself, were devastating. And their boats were proving tougher to kill than ever. They could dive fast, run silent, and strike from the darkness. What the aces in their steel coffins failed to see was that the war was changing. It was becoming a war not of tonnage, but of technology. And the Americans, though slow to start, were masters of innovation. While the U-boats hunted, scientists in laboratories back in Boston and Britain were working on a weapon that would turn the tables completely. It was a weapon that would allow the slowest plane to become the deadliest hunter. It didn't need speed. It didn't need heavy armor. It just needed to see in the dark. And soon, high above the waves, the flying target would get its eyes. The laughter was about to stop. Autumn 1942. A secured laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, known as the Rad Lab. While Reinhard Hardigan and his fellow aces were celebrating their tonnage tallies, a different kind of war was being waged by men in white lab coats. The British had already given the Americans their greatest secret, the cavity magnetron, a device capable of generating powerful, high-frequency microwave pulses. It was the key to radar that was small, light, and incredibly precise. The problem was immense. The existing ASV, or Air-to-Surface Vessel Radar, the Mark II, was a clumsy beast. Its Yagi antennas, looking like oversized TV aerials, had to be plastered all over the wings of large twin-engine planes like the Lockheed Hudson or the Vickers Wellington. For a tiny float plane like the OS2U Kingfisher, carrying such a system was impossible. It would be like strapping a freight car to a bicycle. But the new 10-centimeter microwave radar changed everything. Scientists and engineers at the Rad Lab, working with Philco, developed the ASG, or George, as the pilots would call it. It was a marvel of miniaturization. The entire system, transmitter, receiver, and a small rotating dish antenna, was housed in a streamlined pod that could be mounted under the Kingfisher's wing, perfectly counterbalancing a 325-pound depth charge on the other. A small, green-glowing cathode ray tube was crammed into the observer's cramped cockpit. For the first time, the two-man crew of a tiny scout plane had the power that previously belonged only to a capital ship, the ability to see through fog, rain, and the pitch black of a moonless night. The effect on the crews of inshore patrol squadrons was electric. These men, based in humid hangars from Florida to Brazil, had spent months flying monotonous, frustrating box patterns. They were the Maytag Charlies, flying endless laundry routes, spotting wreckage, rescuing downed pilots, and almost never seeing a live U-boat. They were the taxi squad of the Naval Air Arm. Now a grizzled commander would gather his young ensigns in a locked briefing room. He'd point to a diagram of the new pod. "Gentlemen, the games have changed. You are no longer just spotters. You are no longer just rescue. Starting today, you are hunters." They trained in secret, flying far offshore, learning to read the strange new display. They learned what a convoy of merchant ships looked like, a cluster of large, fuzzy blips. They learned what a crashing wave looked like, a momentary splash of sea return. And they learned the most important signal of all, the sharp, clear, and persistent pip of a U-boat's conning tower surfaced to recharge its batteries. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, the U-boot Waffa remained blissfully ignorant. Their tactical doctrine was built around the night. They would run on the surface in total darkness, their diesel engines pushing them at 17 knots, faster than most convoys. Their lookouts, equipped with the finest Zeiss binoculars, were their eyes. They believed that if they couldn't see the enemy couldn't possibly see them. This was their fatal miscalculation. To the high-frequency radio waves of the ASG radar, a surfaced U-boat was the perfect target. It was a solid steel structure, isolated on a flat, wet plain. It screamed its presence onto the observer's screen, a pinpoint of light that betrayed its exact range and bearing. The Kingfisher pilots, once mocked for their slowness, now realized their weakness was a strength. A PBY Catalina or a B-24 Liberator was a large, loud aircraft. A U-boat's hydrophone operator or a sharp-eared lookout might detect its roaring engines from miles away, giving them precious minutes to dive. But the OS2U Kingfisher, it approached with the quiet thrum of a single Pratt & Whitney Wasp Jr. engine. It was a whisper in the night sky. The U-boat aces had laughed at the Kingfisher because it was a slow, clumsy scout plane. They were right. But they failed to ask what would happen if the scout plane could suddenly see in the dark. What happens when the flying target is given the eyes of a hawk? The stage was set for a terrifying reversal. The hunters, secure in their invisibility, were now being stalked. And the first kill would not be a glorious fleet action, but a shocking, lonely execution in the dark.
July 17th, 1943, 21:50 local time, 70 miles east of Cape Hatteras. The night is absolute. A young pilot, Lieutenant G.D. Bob Mason, holds his OS2U Kingfisher steady at 2,000 feet. Beside him, in the rear seat, his observer, aviation radioman second class Pete Eagle Eye Johnson, leans into the rubber hood of the ASG radar scope. The green sweep of the beam is mesmerizing, hypnotic. For 2 hours it has shown nothing but the fuzzy static of sea return. Boredom, Mason had said earlier at the briefing, boredom is the enemy. Stay sharp. Inside the hull of U-758, Captain Lieutenant Helmut Monsek is enjoying a late meal. His U-boat, a modern Type 7C, is running on the surface, its diesels charging the vital batteries. The air is clear. The lookouts scan the black sky and see nothing but stars. They are safe in the cloak of darkness. Suddenly, Johnson's voice, tense and sharp, crackles over the intercom. Contact, bearing 030, range 6 miles. Mason's heart hammers. This is it, not a drill. He banks the slow Kingfisher gently, a maneuver he has practiced 100 times, turning towards the bearing. Hold it, Eagle. Keep him steady. He's sharp, Johnson whispers, his eyes glued to the scope. A clean pip, definitely a sub. Range 5 miles. He's not moving much. Must be charging. Down below, Monsek and his crew are oblivious. They hear nothing but the rumble of their own engines. 4 miles, Johnson calls out. Starting to get a little sea return, but I still have him clear. 3 miles. 2. All right, Mason says, his voice surprisingly calm. I'm dropping. Going to 800 feet. Arm the charges." He pushes the stick forward, and the Kingfisher begins its slow, quiet descent. The wind whistles a little louder against the canopy. 1 mile, Johnson says. "Steady, steady, he's right ahead. 1/2 mile, get ready." Mason's eyes strain, peering into a void of black. He can see nothing, no white wake, no silhouette. He is flying completely blind, trusting a glowing green dot on his partner's screen. "Now, Bob, now! He's right on top of us!" Mason's thumb slams the pickle switch. The Kingfisher shudders as the 325-pound depth charge drops from the starboard wing. He immediately banks the plane hard, a spray of seawater hitting the pontoon as he skims the waves. A heartbeat later, the night explodes. A brilliant white flash illuminates the sea, followed by a colossal whoomp that physically lifts the small plane. Mason fights the controls, climbing as Johnson spins around in his seat. "I see him! God, I see him! We got him, Bob! He's hit!" Below them, U-758 is in chaos. The depth charge, set for a shallow detonation, has exploded almost directly alongside the surfaced boat. The blast has smashed the periscopes, destroyed the bridge instruments, and hurled the lookouts into the sea. Below decks, lights have shattered, gauges have burst, and water is flooding the control room. Captain Lieutenant Monsek, thrown from his seat, screams, "Alarm! Tauchen! Get us down!" But the boat is already crippled. It wallows on the surface, listing heavily. Mason circles the Kingfisher, its one single landing light now cutting through the darkness, illuminating a scene from hell. He can see men scrambling from the hatches, leaping into the oil-slicked water. The U-boat, a symbol of terror and the apex predator of the Atlantic, is mortally wounded, helpless, its bow pitching up as the stern floods. "He's going down," Mason says, his voice low. "He's going down." They circle for 20 minutes, 2 men in a tiny float plane, watching as the wolf they had hunted in total darkness vanishes beneath the waves. They radio the coordinates, and by dawn a destroyer will be on site to pick up the few stunned survivors. The news of the kill spreads through the inshore patrol squadrons like wildfire. It's not just a victory, it's a revolution. A slow, clumsy Kingfisher, a plane the U-boat crews laughed at, had just stalked and killed a modern U-boat in the dead of night. The new technology had worked. The flying target had bared its teeth. And for the U-boat aces, the laughter, the arrogance, and the happy time, it was all coming to an end. The ocean was no longer a safe place to be, day or night. The hunter had become the hunted. The gene triumph of Lieutenant Mason and Radioman Johnson was not an isolated incident. It was a crack in the dam, and the flood was coming. By late 1943 and into 1944, the ASG George radar and its British equivalent was no longer a rare prototype. It was being fitted to every manner of Allied aircraft. It was mounted on the long-range B-24 Liberators of RAF Coastal Command, turning the Black Pit into a killing ground. It was bolted onto nimble de Havilland Mosquito night fighters, stalking U-boats surfacing in the Bay of Biscay. And most humiliatingly for the U-boot Watha, it was now standard issue on the humble OS2U Kingfisher. The entire Allied strategy in the Atlantic had been reforged. The slow-moving Kingfishers, once relegated to boring inshore patrols, were now key players in a new aggressive tactic, the hunter-killer group. Imagine this.
A small convoy of merchant ships steams through the mid-Atlantic, protected by a handful of destroyers and a small, cheap escort carrier or a larger tender. Circling overhead or catapulted from the ships themselves are the Kingfishers. They are the convoy's eyes. Previously, a wolf pack of U-boats commanded by an ace like Eric Topp would shadow the convoy during the day, remaining submerged. They would wait for the sun to set, knowing the darkness was their shield. Then they would surface, using their superior speed to race into a perfect firing position. Now, that tactic was suicide. The moment a conning tower broke the surface, a pip would appear on a radar screen miles away. A capitan like Nunt, standing on his bridge, breathing the fresh night air, would have no warning. His lookouts would see nothing. His hydrophones would hear nothing. The first sign of an acapt would be the sudden thrum of an engine directly overhead, followed by the blinding flash of a lee light, a powerful searchlight switched on by the aircraft in the final seconds of its attack run. Caught in this artificial daylight, the U-boat was a perfect, silhouetted target. The Kingfisher pilots, no longer the rookies, developed a cold, efficient lethality. They wouldn't just drop one charge. They would straddle the U-boat, dropping a stick of 2 or 3 depth charges set to different depths, creating an inescapable box of concussive force. For the U-boat crews, the psychological impact was devastating. The one place they felt safe, the surface, at night, was now the most dangerous place on Earth. The hunters had become the hunted. Their arrogance turned to raw fear. U-boat crews, once the elite of the Kriegsmarine, began to suffer from crippling combat fatigue. They called these radar-equipped planes Gespenster, ghosts, phantoms that emerged from the dark, killed, and vanished. Admiral Karl Donitz, head of the U-boat arm, saw the reports with growing alarm. His tonnage per month figures, once his pride, were plummeting. His U-boat loss rates were skyrocketing. He wrote in his war diary, "The enemy has rendered the U-boat weapon ineffective. He has achieved this not through superior tactics or strategy, but through superior science." He was right. The U-boat aces had dismissed the Kingfisher because it was slow. They laughed at it. But they hadn't laughed at the scientists at MIT. They hadn't accounted for the power of a microwave beam. The war at sea was no longer a contest of seamanship and courage alone. It was a brutal technological equation. And the OS2U Kingfisher, the slow, methodical, and inescapable airborne destroyer, the laughter of Reinhard Hardigan and his fellow aces, which had echoed across the Atlantic in 1942, was now a distant, hollow memory, replaced by the persistent, ominous ping of radar waves searching for steel in the dark. Berlin, 1944. The Oberkommando der Marine, the Naval High Command, is in a state of panic. Admiral Dönitz, now Grand Admiral, faces the total collapse of his U-boat strategy. The reports from his returning aces, the few who do return, are grim. They speak of a terror in the dark, of being hunted without warning. Germany's response, as always, was technological, but this time it was reactive, not proactive. They were on the back foot, desperately trying to counter a weapon they barely understood. First came the Metox receiver. This was a crude radar detector, nicknamed the Cross of Biscay by its crews because of its flimsy cross-shaped aerial. The idea was simple. If the Allies were using radar, this device would hear the radar's radio pulses before the U-boat's reflection was strong enough for the plane to detect, giving the Capitan a warning. For a few brief weeks, it seemed to work. A U-boat on the surface would suddenly hear a beep, beep, beep in the operator's headphones, and the commander would scream, "Alarm! Tauchen!" The boat would dive, and the frustrated Kingfisher or Liberator pilot would arrive over the spot to find only an empty patch of ocean. But the Allies were already one step ahead. The Rad Lab at MIT had anticipated this. They had already developed the new 10-centimeter ASG radar, which the Metox receiver couldn't detect. The Allies simply switched frequencies. The U-boat crew's temporary relief turned into a new nightmare. Their Metox receivers were silent. They believed they were safe. And then the bombs would fall. Dernitz's next desperate gamble was the Schnorkel, the Snorkel. This was a retractable pipe that allowed the U-boat to run its diesel engines while remaining just below periscope depth. It sucked in fresh air for the engines and crew and vented the exhaust. On paper, it was a brilliant solution. A U-boat could now stay submerged indefinitely, crossing the entire Atlantic without surfacing once. It was, in theory, invisible to radar. But the reality was hellish. The Schnorkel was mechanically unreliable. Its float valve would often slam shut in heavy seas, causing the powerful diesel engines to suck the air directly from the inside of the boat. Crewmen's ears would pop, their lungs would ache, and some were even ruptured. The constant vibration and foul recycled air led to sickness and exhaustion. And worse, it wasn't the invisibility cloak Dernitz had hoped for. The new high-definition ASG radar, operated by a skilled observer, could often pick up the tiny pip of the Schnorkel head itself, slicing through the waves. The Kingfisher, the slow plane, had an advantage here. It could patrol low and slow, its observer's eyes glued to the scope, hunting for the telltale sign of a submerged boat. The U-boat, once a 17-knot surface predator, had been reduced to a 6-knot, blind, asthmatic crawler, suffocating its own crew while being hunted by the very plane it once mocked. The final insult was the weapons integration. The hunter-killer groups became ruthlessly efficient. A Kingfisher or Avenger launched from an escort carrier would get a radar contact. It wouldn't even drop a depth charge. It would simply radio the contact's precise bearing and range to the surface destroyers. The destroyers, like the USS England, would race to the spot. They would confirm the location with their own sonar and then unleash the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar that fired 24 contact bombs into the water. There was no escape. The U-boat, forced to stay down by the circling Kingfisher, was now trapped in a sonar net below, waiting for the inevitable crack of a Hedgehog bomb against its hull. The Vote OS2U Kingfisher had begun the war as a joke. It was a catapult scout, a flying target. But it became the linchpin in a vast, integrated technological system of war. It was the eye in the sky, a slow, patient, and merciless eye that denied the wolf pack the darkness it needed to breathe.
The aces who had laughed were now either at the bottom of the sea or in prisoner of war camps, their boasts of 1942 silenced by a revolution in science they never saw coming.